My first job was with was Stanland, that immediately changed to Pan American. That was a good change because I got a raise when they changed the name. It meant another $20 a month, and my starting salary was $480 a month. Doesn't sound like very much right now, but it was a lot then. A lot of people didn't get jobs because the business was not very good. And I was given a choice of a number of different locations. After being in Oklahoma City, all the people in Oklahoma City wanted to work in the Rockies, and once you got in a town, it was tough to get transfer unless it was within the same division. So I thought, well, I'm going to start in the right division, and I asked for the Rockies. So they gave me a choice of Denver, Salt Lake, Billings, Casper, and there's one or two others that I don't recall. And I took them in inverse orders of production population. And Denver being the biggest, Salt Lake being the next, and I didn't want to be out in the boondocks somewhere. And they gave me Salt Lake. So my first job was in Salt Lake. When I got to Salt Lake, I was told that I would be in field crews. They had reconnaissance field, structural mapping, reconnaissance field work. And the object was to find structures on the surface that may mean structures at depth, and they would bring a seismic crew in behind you and process it that way. The field crews are out at the moment, and I did some local work in the office before they came back, and then I got with the crews and went out. My first job, I was sitting around, they didn't even have enough desks for people. And I was sitting there looking for something to do, and nobody wanted to pay much attention to you. And finally, I was bugging a guy by the name of Jack Century that, geez, I need something to do. I just came out of school. I want to do something. And he said, well, all right, I'll give you this. And he gave me a sample strip colored in the typical formational covers, rock colors that they used in the company, and two blank sample strips. And he said, make two more of these. So my first job was coloring logs. And I says, damn, Jack. I said, I've just come out from my master's degree. Surely I'm better than coloring logs. And he said what was right. He said, it'll do two things. It'll teach you the sequence, and it will teach you the company way of handling the way the little hieroglyphics are there, plus the colors. He said it'll be a good learning experience to you. I found out that I wasn't all that disciplined in learning because it seemed to be a job for me at least, to get these right. But nevertheless, I was plodding along with the two things, and he says, we need these done. And he says, usually the telephone operator does it, but she's busy today. And I said, really, man, that struck me off good. That's fine. And so we were doing it, and then he came in to check me a few times. And finally he said, the telephone operator isn't busy now, we can give this back to her. So that was my first job. But then I went out in the field, and we had two-man crews in southern Utah, and we're surface mapping, reconnaissance field mapping. And we did it with a four-wheel drive truck, international pickup, with a winch and 65 gallons of gas and two tanks. So we were out a lot. We tried to stay in the small towns when we could because it was easier and better. When we didn't, we slept out in the field. And Pan American didn't have these niceties like a tent or anything like that, so you slept either in the truck or in the bed of the truck or sleeping bag on the ground. And we're at the site when you started the field mapping the next day. That was really interesting, and a lot of nice places. The rocks are on the surface. and they're colorful, and it really is awe-inspiring, actually. The We got stuck out on the Caparowitz Plateau one time, got caught by a snowstorm out there. They used to send us in the high areas in the winter and the low areas in the summer, so you're freezing and fighting snow in the winter and boiling in the summer when you were at a lower elevation. It seemed to be that way. And anyway, we got caught out there, couldn't get in, had the entire Mancus section to go through, down a canyon and up the other side, and had an awful lot of trouble getting out. Finally extracted ourselves and got out as a search party was coming in. But there were lots of little fine things, you know. That was near Escalante, Utah, nice little town. And we did that all over southern Utah. And on one occasion, there was a dune field, a lot of sand, and we couldn't get through the thing, so it didn't look like there were any outcrops there. So in one of the high points that we were shooting the Alidade from, I thought I could see an outcrop out there right in the middle of that thing. And I took a shot on it and used that on the map. Well, when it came in, this was on a Wednesday. We were out 10 days and in 4. Supposedly you had the 4 off, but it always ended up you had 2 off. And you were supposed to be able to get off on Thursday and Friday. But when I brought it in, they were immediately interested because it showed a big anticline. And, you know, I told them, how risky it was and, you know, why there was only one shot there and so forth. And but they kept me recontouring it for the rest of the Thursday and Friday. And when I went out to the field on Monday, there was a seismic crew shooting out that indication of subsurface structures. I was a hero for a while because it was shooting out pretty well. But then as they started doing some isopacking with the seismic data, it wiped out at depth. So we never did get a real prospect out of it, but we had a little exciting time. After that, I got involved in my first subsurface assignment was as a junior member of a 3-man team, me being the junior, of 2 more experienced people doing a study in the Uinta Basin. We didn't even have maps. The company had never focused on Uinta Basin at that time. We didn't have maps, we didn't have logs, we didn't have samples, we didn't have anything. And we started from scratch and worked day and night, actually, and to meet the first Ute Indian sale in that area. And our competitor was Chevron. And Chevron was on the floor. We had half the floor and they had the other half of the floor. And when the bids came, we stalemated it. They got half and we got half, just like the officers were almost. And one couldn't act without the other. It's necessary to eventually make an accommodation between the two and get a well drilled. By then I was transferred, so I'm not sure the details, but I was told it was a producer. So the first one I was involved in was a producer. You know, that brought me in the office to do subsurface and well sitting instead of field work. But then as companies were reorganizing, we knew that the Salt Lake office was going to be broken up into a group that went to Denver and a group that went to Farmington, New Mexico. Well, Denver would have been heaven for me, you know, so I did everything I could to get to Denver, including pushing the Uinta Basin, which was going there. And with that, I kept getting more and more authority, I guess you'd say, in the Paradox Basin, including going on a field trip in the Paradox Basin. I thought, this is not good, because sure enough, I'm going to Farmington, and that's what happened. I was transferred to Farmington, New Mexico. And Farmington, it was so small, it was an oil field town, but it was so small at that time that when my wife and we had been married 6 months before that, and by the time we left Salt Lake to go to Farmington to find a place to live. We got there late at night. We drove all the way through town on the main street and out the other side and all the way to the next town over Aztec before we realized we had missed the town. So we had to turn back and come back and look for the motel. But anyway, we transferred to Farmington. I had to build a house, which the Navy also helped me with under the GI Bill, and built a little house and lived there. And our two sons were born in New Mexico in the 3 years that I was there. My work experience was in the Paradox then, and at a fairly young age, I got to be they would call it a unit leader, a project leader, and the Paradox was my purview, and I had 4 other guys working with me, and it was really good. I really liked working the Paradox Basin, and we did some good. One of the recommendations that I had on the budget repeatedly, and it kept getting pushed off repeatedly, was what turned out to be Cache Field, just in the Colorado and the eastern Utah border. By then I had been transferred to Fort Worth in the division office, which is the research division consulting group, they officially call it. The people that weren't too intrigued by it called it the damned ivory tower. And we did projects that the districts could not do or didn't want to do or didn't have the capability of doing, and did them for the different districts. So I went from the Paradox to the West Texas in terms of my work. And I worked on the Cisco Canyon Strong around Horseshoe Atoll and in that general area, and did a project with that, 2 projects actually, and then worked on the Ellenberger. I finished the report, and it changed things in the company, their outlook, and we did some good. It's a good example of using geologists in production problems, I thought. And at Midland Farms Field, Pan American had a big interest, was an operator, and found out that their material balance study was not working, and that they were finding a lot more production than the material balance study told them they ought to be having, and my job was to find out why. They had done 800 feet of core from above the top of the Ellenberger through all the way out the bottom. I'd never seen that much core before, but my job was to go up to Tulsa, to the research lab, and to try to find out why this was happening. They had the 800 feet of core laid out in a room, and I told the boss who was sending me, I says, I've never seen this much core, this will be great. And he says, come to think of it, neither have I, I'll go with you. So the 2 of us went up there, and we looked at it, and here was a project that everybody was scratching their head about, and I had solved within 30 seconds. And the way that it got solved was immediately, if you'd been in the field very much, you could see that this core that had Ellenberger all the way through it with holes you could stick your hand in, you put pencils through, you could blow smoke through, you could do anything. Totally, the porosity, dissolution stuff, was all the way through this thing. But you can't take a sidewall and get a core for core analysis if you're taking just the core analysis, except in the hard spots. And that's what they had done. There'd be all these gaping holes in the core, and then a little zip with a little round plug that they can take it out. And all they had done is plug analysis and never looked at it. And that was a solution to that problem. So I did a report that showed, what it said on the core analysis, and you got a picture of the core and what the core looked like, and did all that sort of thing. The division superintendent was an engineer, very hard-crusted guy, and he and I had always gotten along very well. But he called up one day and said, just had a little cracker box office, less than half the size of the room we're in now. And he said, Ray, my boss, tells me that you've got something interested on the Ellenberg. And I said, yes, I do, I think. And he says, but get it out, I'm coming down. So he came down to the office, sat on a table over there, and I was got out my slides and things and showing them on the back of the door. And he was just getting madder and madder and madder. The more I talked and the more I showed him these comparisons and everything, he started swearing a blue streak and grabbed the phone, called up his second in command, get those idiots down here. And I had about 6 or 8 guys sitting around the office on the floor and on the tables and on the other chair that I had. And we'd go on, and they're all visibly uncomfortable. And when it come to a particular point, and the superintendent would just start cursing a blue streak and really cutting them down. You pack of idiots, etc. And went on. But with that, it was the solution to why the material balance study was not telling true numbers. And I was not very highly thought of by the engineering department for a while. But then we got to be on good terms, and everything was all right. I was in Fort Worth for a year and a half. I knew I wasn't going to be there long, and was transferred to Tyler. And in Tyler, coming from that so-called ivory tower, they said, well, why don't you just spend some time acclimating yourself and reading the reports, and let us know what you'd like to work on. So I did that, and after a period, they said, what do you think needs work? And I told them I thought that a study of the James limestone could be profitable. And the James limestone was the producing formation at Fairway Field. It was a major field, major oil field, and relatively new. And Pan American didn't have anything in it. And so I did that, and that turned out to be quite popular, and I was asked to give that presentation to Pan Am's carbonate seminar 2 years. And as part of the 3 talks that they had from people from all over the country. The seminar included a week in the field out in the Bahamas, and a week out in West Texas in the ancient, and then a week in Tulsa at the research lab doing the detail parameters. And I was part of that setup. But then they decided to go to a computer project, and I've been ducking that. I ducked it in Fort Worth. They said, you got to do this. They didn't have any way of doing it. You didn't even have a map. You couldn't digitize. You couldn't do anything. And I finally told them, I'm about to finish this thing, and you set me back. Why not just finish it, and if there's something else, then we'll start from zero. And the same thing happened in the Smackover. And but the guy that was ahead of the Smackover at the time was a heck of a crusty little guy, and he didn't want to do it. And he set up a framework for it that I didn't like when I finally get in it. But he was doing it, and then he got mad and quit. So who's going to do this thing? And they put me in it, and it turned out that was advantageous also, because I then got to be the guru of the Smackover and finish the project on the computer project on time. And, I thought it was well done. They don't use it anymore, but got to know the Smackover very well as a result of that. And after 3 years, they broke up the Tyler office, and I went to Fort Worth. And by then, I was what they call project geologist, which is a lot of companies call area geologist, handling East Texas. Well, I've done a lot of work, like I said, in East Texas, and had done some recent work for a company on the Cotton Valley Pinnacle Reef, which is a very strong play at that time. And when that project ended, then I got to looking at Mims and Dew fields, Mims Creek and Dew, which were Anadarko fields in the Bossier Shale, which is the sands in the shale. And I knew they were doing almost, one well right after another and making completions at it. And I started looking at where that went down dip because I knew there was a carbonate shelf edge that these things were over. And I figured it was the architecture of the play. I had some reasonings that probably wouldn't be adequate to go into here, but as it went off into the basin, they didn't release wells. They were all tight, except the older ones had been released. So I put together a composite log of the wells that I could find that I thought showed a gradation out into the deeper waters. And it showed from the sands that you could see on the shelf to increasing thickness with more sands scattered through a bigger section, of course, but better looking sands in terms of porosity and permeability, and a sequence of sands separated widely by shales. And the shales were a good trap, seal, and source. And it was stratigraphic entirely. I knew where the carbonate shelf was at Cotton Valley. I could see the section, particularly the Bossier section, thickening as you went into the basin, into the southeast and east. And I saw the sand buildups in the old wells where there would be sands scattered in between all the shale layers. And the shale was a seal and it was a source and really the trap also. So I thought, where can we find where this is coming off the shelf? And as far as I knew, the shelf was fairly uniform up around Mims Creek and Dew, and I didn't know of any breaks at least, but I did know of one way down on the south side, and I thought if it comes out of any place with any force and any extent, it ought to be out of this. It was a crease in the edge of the shelf, if you would, a canyon, chasm, whatever you want to call it, and the sands ought to come from there. And if they came off the shelf, draining down into this and out into the deeper water, it ought to be a turbidite deposit with turbidite fans and all the various structures that are involved with that. So that was the whole total concept. There were reasons why I thought there was a crease in the shelf, but that'd take too long to go into here. But nevertheless, the shelf was disrupted one way or another there. It did form a re-entered in the shelf, and I think that was the funnel from which the sands were deposited in the deeper water. The whole pitch to the investors were that if it went out into the deeper water, the sands would come out and off the end of the shelf, and the velocity would start to be distributed, and the mix of sand and mud and all sorts of things coming off the shelf would then come out and be winnowed in such a way that you would get the coarser sand particles, the sand grains, fairly close on the slope, downslope, and the finers would be winnowed out into the deeper water. So mud would be gone, relatively clean rocks, relatively thick, relatively concentrated, and you had the reservoir. Now the reservoir was encased by shale, and the shale was, like I said, the source and the seal. And the source was such that it filled the sands. There's no water, no free water in the thing. Connate water, of course, but no free water. And that was a whole total concept. Now the question is, once it gets out into the deeper water on the shelf slope and the deeper portions, where does it go? Well, the immediate place is the pile, if you want to call it that, right at the mouth of the channel. And then with longshore type of currents, deep currents, distributing along that shelf, parallel more or less to the shelf. And I didn't know how far to go. I didn't know how deep to go. I knew somewhere out there it was going to be gone, unless you had big channels like the Mississippi does that go for tens of miles. And I didn't think it was that strong a situation. So I kept fairly in close on the shelf, and thought I knew where the center of it was. And then I knew it got more complicated in structure and pattern to the south, and so I extended north as far as I thought was reasonable. The end result is that we, on that concept, started buying acreage ourselves, and we've got pretty shallow pockets, so we ran out of our own capabilities fairly fast. And when you have a play that has the opportunity for a lot of acreage, and some of it we had to wait to have it expire and that sort of thing, you need money. And so we had to find some money. You can't show that to just everybody. You had to have them fully trustworthy and know they're not going to help you when you don't want their help. They help you through yourself. And we finally found a fellow by the name of Guma Aguiar, Aguiar, first-class fellow who had dropped into the office several times, and that I had met casually before that. And Guma said he wanted to get into a play and would like to do some business with us. We don't have that happen very often. When they come in and ask to do business with you, we have to go sell. And so this, we were slow about it. And Guma came by about 3 times, and we had checked him out. And when he said he'd like to see something, we showed it. And he took it and provided the money. He, with his uncle from New York, named by Tom Kaplan, provided the money. Guma did the work, put it together, and so forth, and did the oversight with us. But we did everything. He let us do what we knew how to do, and all he did was furnish the money to let us do it. And with that, we put together over 40,000 acres over time, and drilled the first well. And we drilled the first well down, and we couldn't get him to complete it. It was obviously a producer. First well was not at an opportune spot. It was at a convenient spot. We had run about $20 million already with not a well. So we spotted the well as close to the main road as we could get it, and as cheap a location we could get it. I thought it was too close to the shelf edge, but I thought it would be a producer. In fact, Guma said, well, how do we know it's going to produce? And I said, Guma, this is a little egotistical, I guess, but I said, I'll give you 100% guarantee that you're going to find sands and that they will be productive. And I said, now the sands might not be very good, and it might not be very productive, but you will not have any dry holes. And so far that's been true. But anyway, we got the well down, and by then money was getting kind of tight, and he had raised some money from various financial entities in New York and various other places. And it put a bunch of money in it, and they stopped. And they were raising money to be able to complete it. And I think there was probably more to that than I'm aware of, but nevertheless they stopped. And in the meantime, Encana had apparently come on to the same concept and approached Leor, who this company turned out to be, approached Leor with a request to buy in. And they bought in 30% for about $80 million. And it was to be designed where they completed the first well and drilled 8 others through the heart of where I thought the big turbidite deposits would be, to give a network through it. And they did that. As they were doing that, and they were finding the sands, they wanted to buy 20% more, which they bought. And I don't know the exact numbers, but they were way up there. And they bought that. That gave them 50%. There was 50% was still with Leor et al. And as things went on, Encana kept claiming that's not enough for us, and so forth and so forth. And as the wells developed, and Canna was the operator, and as the wells developed, they wanted to buy it all. And Leo had a chance to sell at 50% for $2.55 billion, and they took it. And so Canna owns all the working interest. And we had a working interest to start with, but it was a override with a convertible to a working interest. But because they were raising money, it was not attractive to be raising money with a little nitpicking outfit that they didn't know whether they could carry their load or not, that might have a working interest. So they asked us to stay with the override, which we did. Turns out to be fortuitous because we couldn't have kept up with the drilling anyway. After Encana got going, they were drilling, the highest number was 14 wells at one time, and they're doing currently 7 wells now. And Leor took the money and ran, and they get out of the business. And Guma is over in Israel at the moment, living there most of the time.
In developing the field, can you mention anything about the size of these wells and what ultimate recoveries might be?
Yeah, the individual wells, IP for, I would guess, an average of about 20 million. They've had highs in the mid-60s. And the ultimate production from them will probably be in the 20 billion or so. And the wells run in depth from about 14 to 19,000. And they average, 10 million or so, depending on dollars, depending on what depth they go to. We don't have a lot of data on the completion zones, but there are some zones that are quite thick and some zones that are quite thin, 30, 40 feet. And oddly enough, some of the thinner zones produce better than the thicker zones. And the answer is the porosity and permeability. And we've had porosities that range from, well, they have a cutoff of 6%, too low. But most of them are between 10 and 15%, but we've got up to about 28% or so. In other words, pretty darn good reservoirs. I am told they now have a couple, and Canada doesn't share a lot with us, but I'm told that they have a couple of cores now with impermeabilities up to 30 millidarcies. When I was, selling the thing, I thought it'd be maybe up to 20 millidarcies. But the more the better, and I think those wells with the better porosity and permeability have better porosity, have more permeability than that. The field that I've seen in some of the Encana reports, they expect their share recoverable to be 1.8 trillion. And so there's about 25% royalty and override and that sort of thing. So it's about quarter more, 25% more than that. So it's a couple of trillion. And I've heard numbers up to over 3 trillion, and I kind of prefer those. I really do. I really do.
And let me ask the question. A couple technical questions, and if you can't comment, that's fine. Overall thickness, what's the kind of variability in the reservoir?
The about the thinnest you would consider maybe 10 feet, but we've had some that are over 200. And oddly enough, the 200s, because of the permeability and porosity problems, are not some of the better wells. But they look better on a log.
In a column, John, of say 600 or 700 feet, how much sand might accumulate in one well?
It varies highly, Ed. And I think with a turbidite type of situation, you'd have the same thing you'd have on the surface, really, in the water. But as the sand comes out and forms an accumulation, then the next one may be a little offset. So sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 sands. And to go further into the thickness, they might be 10 to 50 feet. Varying a good deal. And one well might have 6 or 8 of them. One well might have 1.
What spacing are you drilling these wells on?
640 in East Texas, it's pretty competitive for acreage. And we started with 640 acres. I don't know this for fact, but at the moment I think they may be going to some 320s in the sweeter spots. But it's variable. Depends on what the situation is.
It sounds like the thicker sands are channel fill and the thinner sands are probably levee overbank thin beds.
That's the way I think
And it
of it.
sounds like the channel fill are actually the poor reservoirs and the thin beds are the ones, you know.
I haven't quite said that, but that's what I
fine.
think.
Yeah, okay.
And the reason I think that is that it's observable.
Yeah,
But it's hard to tell somebody. It's hard to tell somebody that the better wells are not the thicker ones because they sure do look pretty.
right.
But they just aren't as porous as some of the other ones.
Has Encana or anyone else shot 3D? Can they start to map out the reservoir pretty accurately? They realize it's fairly deep, but.
We didn't have anything. And from the years of work in various ways, I've had some 3D, but over on the shelf. On the shelf, which is on the Cotton Valley Shelf, overlying that, there are a lot of Bossier sand production. They're fairly thin. The porosities and permeabilities are average, but they're lower pressured. They don't produce as much. And I would say the average is between 1 and 3 BCF per well. Now they've had studies that have downsized that to even 40 acres, and they tell me, I don't know this to be true, but they tell me the pressures and the production is the same, 1 to 3 BCF total, and that's when there's little risk, that's all right. But we were looking for something that was a swing for the fence, and we wanted bigger volumes, producibility plus more reserves. And the total reserves, the recoverable reserves, ought to be pretty good.
So let me go back to the 3D question then. Have they shot 3D and has it helped them in terms of infill targeting, anything like that?
This is partly a political problem. Okay. You may not want to put this in there, but the reality is that they have shot 3D, and Encana and Leor, when Leor is still real, and some other companies shot it as a spec type thing, and they shot 3D over it. We don't have access to that, so I don't know. But the idea was to marry, and the idea of the network and everything was to marry the seismic to the reality of the wells and go from there and see if it would help. I suspect it is probably some help, but I don't know that to be fact at this stage. We're supposed to have the rights to that too. When we gave up the working interest, we retained the rights of a working interest partner, which Leor guaranteed to us, and then when Leor sold, passed on to Encana, but nobody wants to recognize that right now, so we're still working on it.
Let me ask you one thing about development. This is really a very, very broad kind of development scenario. Has anyone considered doing horizontal wells or anything? Or
I've talked about it, but nobody's done it here. The wells at $10 million up, depending on what you do. And they are trying to cut the cost, but if you try to go horizontal, it's going to really add to the cost. But in in the channel, so-called channel, the big, thick things, beds that don't have a lot of porosity and permeability, that might be really appropriate. But you'd have to map it. But given the depositional setting, you'd know about which direction to go and everything. So I don't know, it'd be nice to try, but because of the numbers, it's hard to try things and get other people to try them.
I know you're just drilling the initial wells in the field, and you have approximately how many wells today?
We got over 90.
Over 90 wells. And how many more wells might there be in this field?
Depends on how they downsize. There have been talk of downsizing all the way to 160. I can't envision that, but I think 320 acres is quite possible. And they may be doing that some now, I'm not sure. It's about 90 wells and drilling, like I said, 7 at the moment.
How much of the 40,000 acres would you consider in this particular field?
I think all of the 40,000, but I think it's probably bigger than that. And Guma says, well, you didn't tell me we should have got more acreage. And I said, well, we're running out of money. And, I wanted to get you something we all thought we could do. And, oh, no, we had plenty of money. Okay. Here's my checkbook, but there just doesn't happen to be enough in it, And, but we bought everything that we could at the time. And when you have a conceptual play that doesn't have the reality of 3D and wells, a lot of wells to support it and that thing, it's hard to know where to stop. The only criticism Guma has given me is you didn't tell me how big it was. I didn't know how big it would be. I told him it should be between 250 to 500 billion, but that's less than a third of what it's turning out to be. So it's when it's something that arm wavy, let's put it that way, it's difficult to be too precise. I would have liked a lot of acreage, but I felt I had to do reality.
John, what do you consider your greatest long-term scientific or exploration contributions?
As a contribution, I've tried to be active from very early in my career with joining in the activities of societies at various levels. I mentioned that I'd been involved with Landis and some other authors in the publishing of petroleum resources and basement rocks, and I was asked to give a talk on that in Farmington, New Mexico, and I'd been with the company maybe a year and a half to 2 years, and so my first involvement in a professional activity was then. And then I've had peripheral contacts with it ever since, various committees and that sort of thing, primarily in Houston when I got more stable as being in the same place for some length of time. I've been heavily involved at all the levels from HGS, GCAGS, SIPES, APG of course, and AGI. So I think you could say my contribution is mainly enthusiasm for the profession and its organizations, and a love to be dealing with geologists and really realizing that it benefits me besides hopefully everybody else. And somebody else's enthusiasm affects me, and I hope mine affects them.
And of course you went on to become president of APG.
I was a president of APG, and I consider that a crowning achievement in my career. Really liked it.
In your opinion, what are the characteristics needed to be a successful explorationist?
I think to be a successful explorationist, you've got to work pretty hard. You've got to stay at it. You've got to think what oil and gas does in the subsurface, and realize that the end result of whether you're going to find anything is source, reservoir, trap, and seal, and you've got to look for those and envision those and work towards those and follow all the data you can to prove or disprove what you think, the concepts, the premises, and go from there. And then most geologists don't have a thick enough wallet themselves, so they have to go raise the money. The toughest part of the business, I think, is trying to get somebody else to believe what you say. But you've got to keep at it, and sometimes the only one that will believe you is the one you need. And the ones that are wishy-washy about it would probably be a problem anyway, so you're better off doing it that way. I think fortitude, persistence. I've been told I'm a little too aggressive, but I don't think so. You want your prospects proven and want to do everything you can to see whether they're right.
John, what advice would you give to the young earth scientists today, geologists, geophysicists, coming into the business, especially in a time when the oil and gas prices are low?
Through my career, there have been these big cycles in the oil and gas. I wanted to be a petroleum geologist, so I was married to that. I guess if I couldn't make a living somewhere else, I would have adjusted and tried to do something else. But I think there again, just like in exploration, that persistence is the key to it, and to stay with it. I have told university groups that if you want to be an oil and gas finder, then do it, and go do it, and let things fall where it may, and you will find a way, one way or the other, to do it. But stay at it and keep trying. There have been 2 or 3 people, young guys in the profession, that I've given that advice to, and they've hung in there through times I'm not even sure I could have made, and finally made their first hit with a job and gone on to a successful career since that. I think a geologist is never loved, but I think he's always wanted because of what he can provide, and I think he has to keep trying to push to get that done, to get the job done.